Good afternoon and welcome. Today I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Leah Whigham. She has a PhD in nutritional sciences with an undergraduate degree in biochemistry. She's an expert in obesity and a self-proclaimed obesity scientist. She's the founding director of the Center for Community Health Impact. We discuss a wide array of topics including Dr. Whigham's education and professional experience, her contributions to the scientific community, her work here in El Paso, and we broadly discussed the topic of obesity and contributing factors. In addition, I conducted my own survey in which 40 people participated. During the interview with Dr. Whigham, we discussed the effectiveness of specific surveys. For my survey, I asked participants to answer a self-reporting questionnaire regarding circumstantial and direct factors of obesity. During my conversation with Dr. Whigham, we discussed both the benefits and detriments of self-reporting survey data, as well as other types of surveys utilized by the scientific community. Here are my findings. 50% of participants considered themselves to be overweight or obese. Ages ranged anywhere from 18 years old to 65 and up, with the majority of the participants being between the ages of 25 and 34 years old. The following ethnicities are represented in this data: White Caucasian, Black African American, Hispanic Latino, Asian, or another race that wasn't listed. 45 of the participants reported having one or more of the following health conditions: arthritis, depression, diabetes, high blood pressure, asthma, or another type of health condition. Participants were also asked to report their earned annual income. 57.5% had an earned income of $100,000 or more. 35% had an earned income of $50,000 to $100,000. And 7.5% had between $15,000 and $50,000. Lastly, participants were asked to choose the answer that best describes where they live, and this is how they ranked. Coming in at number 1 was suburban, 2 was rural, and 3 being urban.
Alrighty.
All right. So can you tell me kind of about a little bit about yourself and your professional training and experience?
So I consider myself an obesity scientist by training. There's not a degree in obesity per se, but
Okay.
I started off, my undergraduate degree was in biochemistry. I got interested in that because of a research experience I was fortunate enough to have when I was a high school student.
All right.
And so that's where I kind of fell in love with research and science. And then I really enjoyed the research, but I found that I was always seeking to figure out how to apply the research more to impact human health.
Right.
So when I finished my undergraduate degree in biochemistry, I wanted to continue on in school, but I wasn't quite sure how. I had considered, maybe a graduate degree program in something like physical therapy or physician assistant. I'd already kind of ruled out going to medical school because I had shadowed a physician and that didn't interest me. And so I was kind of struggling to decide,
Right.
what am I going to do with this degree in biochemistry? I did not just want to do biochemistry research because it seems so mechanistic and I couldn't always understand the application of it.
Okay.
And why it was important. For example, I was studying mitochondrial DNA in dairy cattle.
Oh, wow.
In this lab that I worked in as a high school student. And I didn't really have much interest in dairy cattle or their mitochondrial DNA and their genetic inheritance patterns for milk production. So I think what happened is biochemistry does have application. That's why people are doing the research. But as a student, I had a hard time understanding, I understood the application, but the application didn't interest me. So I was trying to figure out, as I finished my degree in biochemistry, what can I do where the science that I'm doing, maybe using biochemistry, molecular biology, but the science I'm doing will directly apply to content area that I'm interested in. So I decided I would get a job working in a lab, and just to get more experience and to support myself, and then use that time to figure out what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted some kind of graduate degree, but I just didn't know what. So I took 2 years. I got a job in a different city from where I did my undergrad, but I purposefully looked for jobs there because there was a large academic medical center there. So I wanted to be able to have access, because I knew I wanted something health related. So I wanted to be able to have access in a place that would have degree programs that were health related. As you can see, my concepts were all kind of fuzzy. So I said, well, let's at least get a job in this town that has a medical school and large medical research facility, because maybe that'll help me. I'll be around people who maybe are doing stuff that I would find interesting. So I got that job working in a lab for 2 years. And I used that first year just to figure out, what might I want to do? That was my goal, was to have an idea at the end of that first year what I want to do. Use the second year to apply to different graduate programs and make a decision. And I found it was important that I had that kind of time limit in my head, because job I had, there were several other friends I made during that time who worked in similar lab settings, and they didn't really have that kind of time limit in mind, and they were mostly just dissatisfied with their jobs. They were kind of bored by it, but they weren't really making progress to figure out where to go from. So by that second year, I was applying to graduate schools and had discovered that I'd always had an interest in nutrition, and even more specifically, weight loss, obesity. I had come from a family where my family had struggled with weight. My mom was perpetually on, the next weight loss diet, fad, and so forth, right, trying to manage her weight. And so, but I had not chosen to major in nutrition in college, because I thought a career in nutrition was being a dietitian. And I thought being a dietitian was just about designing diets for hospital patients. I didn't realize there was much more to it than that. Now I understand it's a much more diverse and nuanced field. So what happened during that first year of exploring, I discovered there were graduate programs in nutrition where people were learning to apply the kind of basic research skills that I had really enjoyed in high school and my undergrad, but applying them to nutrition questions. And so that sounded much more compelling to me. So I started applying for graduate programs in nutrition, more or less thinking I wanted to focus on obesity and weight loss, but mostly just thinking, get a solid foundation in nutrition. And biochemistry is actually overlaps tremendously with nutrition, because there's, all the molecular mechanisms within our body are driven by and require various nutrients. So fundamental to nutrition is biochemistry, but when we talk about a career in nutrition, you're also talking about other aspects of ensuring people have access to healthy food and are motivated to eat healthy food. And, right, it goes beyond the biochemistry. There's behavioral science involved. There's food systems involved. It's really diverse. So at this point, I was just thinking, this is really cool. I love biochemistry, and biochemistry is basically nutrition. And I'm going to start applying my basic science skills towards research questions that I'm more interested in, moving beyond that mitochondrial DNA and dairy cattle. This project. So I ended up getting accepted. I was told that there were kind of the top 3 universities in the country for nutrition, that one of them was University of Wisconsin in Madison. I was still a little kind of like, I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just jumping in here trying to figure this out. So I didn't apply to all 3 of those top schools because one was on the West Coast, one was on the East Coast, and I was in Iowa at the time. That's where I spent most of my youth and where I'd done my undergraduate. So I applied to University of Wisconsin and several other Midwest universities to have nutrition programs. Because I had been told that Wisconsin was one of those top 3, when I got accepted there, it was kind of a no-brainer. I just said, okay, that's where I'll go. So I went to school there thinking I would get a master's degree first and then try and decide if I wanted to go on to get a PhD. But I remember in that first month just loving everything about the program and thinking, oh my gosh, I found the perfect fit. This is what I'm meant to do. And so I committed to doing the PhD right from the beginning. So I looked, when you're in graduate school in this kind of research program, you need to find a research home in addition to taking your courses. I knew all this because I had worked in labs. That was a big advantage. I could have understood how graduate school works before I got there. So I knew I needed to find a professor who was doing research, was willing to take graduate students and hopefully have funding for paying them on research assistantships. And ideally, I would have chosen a professor who studied obesity. I asked about that, and there was really no one at the time who had openings in their lab for grad students focused on obesity. So instead, I just kept an open mind, looked at different professors, and our program had a process. Where they pulled all the first year students together and had professors who had openings in their lab come and give short presentations about their research. And that's when I heard a presentation by the professor who would eventually become my graduate dissertation advisor. He gave a short talk, and I just really liked his approach. He was a nutritional immunologist. So he wasn't studying obesity per se, but he was looking at this interface between immunology and nutrition. What I really liked about his approach was it was very creative, innovative. He thinks outside the box, and he was really driven by the end application of the research question. So all of his research projects had real world, big impact kinds of end game in mind. Some researchers, when they talk about their research, they get kind of lost in the details, like, oh, I'm trying to figure out, how this pathway is regulated by this molecule. And that was the same reason why I didn't want to go on and get a PhD in biochemistry. I'm like, no, I'm in this for understanding the application. So the fact that this one professor in particular really talked about big picture, why is this important? That just appealed to me. So I ended up getting accepted to work in his lab, and my dissertation focused on the particular kind of fatty acid called conjugated linoleic acid and how it impacts the immune function. He was doing several CLA immune function and fatty acid immune function projects, and the one I took the lead on was specific to a kind of immune reaction called type 1 hypersensitivity, those are the kinds of immune reactions like allergies and so I did it was still basic science research, but I was using, my previous research had been more at the cellular level, doing cell culture and molecular techniques in the lab. And in this particular project, it was a little more at the whole animal physiology level, where I was manipulating the nutrition and then, causing the animal to be sensitized to an allergen, and then studying the effect of the specific dietary intervention on those allergic reactions. Still looking at molecular levels like release of histamine in different tissues, or expression of RNA to make protein and things like that. So it was a really fun project, and I loved the research area, but I still always had this inkling that I wanted to study obesity. So what I decided to do was kind of keep my eye open when you finish a PhD and you're planning on a research career. For most career paths, you need what's called postdoctoral fellowship training. So you continue to work with another researcher, more senior researcher. You've got your PhD and you're kind of in a fellowship training mode. So you're not still a student, but you're not quite independent on your own, responsible for a research lab or a research clinic and so forth. So I decided I hadn't gotten too far down the path of planning my postdoc experience and applying when I was at dinner. I was a speaker at a conference, and there was another speaker there who was from my same university, another professor, who also happened to sit on my graduate committee. And so we were sitting next to each other at dinner, and he said to me, what are you planning to do for your postdoc fellowship? And I said, well, I haven't figured that out yet. He said, I think you should come work with me. And he happened to be a professor who studies obesity.
Oh, cool.
He's a physician scientist. So he had a lab where he did, more basic science experiments, but he also had a clinic where he ran studies with humans. And it really appealed to me to learn. I kind of progressed from understanding how to use really basic molecular biology techniques to answer research questions. That was kind of my undergrad years. And then during graduate school, continuing to use those basic techniques, but applying them in kind of whole animal physiology models. And I was going to be able to continue doing that in his lab. He was interested in my immunology background because he studied a virus that causes obesity.
Oh.
But he also did work with this particular fatty acid that I've been studying called CLA, but looking at its effects on obesity. And he was, it just so happens about the time I started in his lab, he got grant funding to do a clinical trial. So studying the effects of that fatty acid in humans using a weight loss protocol. And so that's where I ended up going for my first postdoc fellowship, was working with him. And that's really how I got started doing obesity research. And I just really loved the field. I felt like this was where my passion was really what I wanted to focus on. And so that's kind of how I shaped my career at that point. And I had a series of other training, postdoctoral training, where I continued to work with him, but also with other people. Then I ended up with a job in a clinical department. This was all still in Madison, Wisconsin, where I studied. There was a clinician there who was really interested in how obesity affects women's health, and especially women's fertility, because he does a lot of treatment work with fertility. So I got to study a particular metabolic disorder in women called polycystic ovary syndrome, and designed a study to kind of look at the energetics, what happens in women with PCOS differently from women with PCOS, and does obesity influence that? And so I got to learn some really cool techniques that are important in human research in obesity during that time. But that was all of these jobs since graduate school through this time were all funded through grant, which is pretty typical when you're in kind of that early career postdoctoral fellowship time. But it's very tenuous. You still have a job as long as you're bringing in grant money. That's not super stable, and it's a stressful, kind of exhausting way to live your life. So
I can imagine.
the whole time I was still applying for, what in my head seemed like real jobs. I mean, those were real jobs that have more of a permanent, long-term position nature to them. And I had several job offers that, for various reasons, didn't feel like the right fit. I didn't accept them. But then I got an offer with the USDA. And so U.S. Department of Agriculture has an internal research arm called the Agricultural Research Service. And within that Agricultural Research Service, they study all kinds of things from forestry to animal science to crop science. But nutrition is one of the big arms within the Agricultural Research Service. Mm-hmm. And they have human nutrition research centers, 6 of them throughout the country. And I applied, there were job openings in 2 of those where the job focused on obesity. And so I applied to those positions, and I ended up accepting a position working at the Human Nutrition Research Center that's in Grand Forks, North Dakota. Most people don't even know it exists there, but it had been there for over 30 years by the time I joined them. Really well-established research center that had been focused on trace mineral research and nutrition, but had just a year or 2 before I went there, had switched to focus on obesity. So they were looking for new obesity scientist positions. And so I got hired there and was put into a position of lead scientist over, with a team of other scientists to run a research program there. So I got to do some really cool experiments there because it was the most well-equipped research facility I'd ever been in with regards to the staff and the facilities and the equipment and so forth, based on that. So I didn't have to leave that job, but I told myself I was going to keep my mind open. My kids were also at an age where if we were going to relocate, I would rather do it then than later. They were both kind of early preschool and early elementary school during those years that we were in North Dakota. So it was a great place to live, great people to work with, but I'll just keep my mind open in case other opportunities come up. But I wasn't like urgently looking for another job. But as chance would have it, a recruiter called me a few months after I had kind of come to this realization and said, hey, I have this job in El Paso. We'd like you to interview for it. One of your colleagues highly recommends you. I listened to the job, and here I am doing all this, mostly now human research study types of research questions. I wasn't doing as much in animals anymore. It was much more at the clinical research level or human subjects research level. And what this person was asking me to apply for was a job that would be in charge of changing the prevalence of obesity across the whole region, which requires understanding the individual level of obesity, for humans, of course, but actually required skills that I didn't have training in and was, beyond what I had ever formally studied or had experience with. But I had been involved with a national organization since my first postdoc fellowship called the Obesity Society. And at their annual conference, they cover all aspects of obesity. So they have scientific presentations on, molecular mechanisms of obesity and the latest research in that area, on human studies research, on clinical treatment of obesity, but also on things like community-based strategies to address obesity at a population level, or public health strategies for obesity, policy-based work focused on obesity. So because of that exposure through this national organization and interacting with colleagues more broadly and globally in the field of obesity, I was able to put forward my thoughts about how you would address obesity on a regional level, apparently in a convincing enough way that the search committee offered me the job. So I came to El Paso to start this new research center with kind of this underlying focus of addressing obesity regionally in the Paso del Norte region. And have you heard the Paso del Norte Health Foundation?
I have. Not until I looked you up a little bit, but yeah.
Someone there sent you to, didn't they?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, that's right. Paso del Norte Foundation is a private foundation that was created when a local hospital was sold. A public local hospital was sold to a private entity And this commonly happens. I didn't know this at the time. I learned all about this world of foundations. It's a whole world in and of itself after I moved here. So I'm just kind of giving you a quick synopsis here. But what will often happen is it can be referred to as a conversion foundation. So it's when public entity is sold to a private entity, then it's I don't know. There's probably legal ramifications, but also just what's considered good is to take the proceeds of that sale and do something good for the community, right? Because in this case, this hospital that was publicly owned had a lot of public investment in it. And so by selling it to a private company that was now going to take over running it, but they're now on their own, they're going to make profit, and that's how they're going to keep it afloat. What are we going to do with that money that essentially the public should get the benefits from that sale because it was all publicly owned? So I really don't know a whole lot about this. I just know it happened in the case of the foundation. So what they did was the money was invested and they set up a foundation with a board of directors and everything to oversee it that would use the proceeds of those investments. So the money that comes, and it's all regulated through tax codes, and it's a whole complex world in and of itself that I won't bore you with the details, and I don't know most of the details, but they get special tax exempt status, if they use that money, in a responsible way to help the community. So there's foundations like this all over the world. This is just one, and this is one type of foundation.
Right.
So in this case, the founding members of the board decided that they would focus on health promotion and disease prevention. Having been money that came from a hospital, they kind of decided, hey, why don't we try and take this money to help our community not need hospitals so much? How can we keep people from developing diseases in the first place?
Right.
So that's kind of the broad premise of the Paso del Norte Health Foundation. And I don't think that's at all what your paper is about, but I just wanted you to kind of understand where the funding for the start of this center came from.
Right.
So what they were doing at that time, so this was 10, 12 years ago, they were starting to use a model that has been described for solving complex problems at like a community or population level. And the model is called collective impact model. And if you want me to send you a citation or a reference about that, you can also just Google collective impact. Lots of papers and so forth on it.
Right.
There's a paper from, I want to say it's 2011 or 12, Stanford Review is the name of the journal. Stanford Review something or other is the name of the journal. Mm-hmm. And it talks about this model. Collective impact means that by using this model, you are more likely to coordinate efforts and drive bigger impact and a more sustainable impact than if you don't use this model, which happens in most communities. You've got people who are maybe trying to do similar types of things, and they're kind of all good intent and they're out there doing good work. But when it's not coordinated, it's less likely to have as much impact. So you have smaller isolated impacts instead of collective.
Right.
And the model for collective impact says that if you have 5 components, you're more likely to drive collective impact. And one of those 5 components is the backbone or organization that ensures coordination and making sure that those 5 components are all working together. So at the time, and the other components of the collective impact model are to have a common agenda, which means partners who all have a similar goal agree upon what's our agenda, what are we trying to accomplish, so that they're working towards shared goals. Mm-hmm. So a common agenda, continuous communication, mutually reinforcing activities, and then a shared measurement system. It sounds kind of obvious, but it gets missed a lot in this kind of work, that we don't measure if we're having an impact, or we don't measure it well, or we measure it in a dozen different ways that are like comparing apples to oranges.
Right.
So a shared measurement system for collective impact model can be really powerful because you can't determine if you're successfully reaching the goals of your common agenda if you're not assessing it. If you're not measuring, okay, this program was intended to have this impact. We don't measure change in that particular outcome that we're interested in. We don't know if we're having that impact.
Exactly.
Well, if we don't. So by measuring it, we can tell, is it working? Is it not working? And usually it works a little, but maybe not really well. And then you can figure out from other evaluation data how to improve it even better. So that shared measurement system is important because if you now have a dozen partners who all have some shared goal, like one of the goals in our common agenda was to increase fruit and vegetable intake throughout the region. And it's a really common, popular goal to like a lot of community organizations like to target that for various reasons. I'm sure you know of community programs that try and get people to eat more fruits and vegetables.
Right.
But if we measure fruits and vegetables, there's lots of ways you can measure. Did a certain program or a certain policy or some other kind of change in the community change fruit and vegetable intake? You can measure it so many different ways. But the problem is if you measure it all those different ways, you might not, you almost always can't compare them. So if what you're trying to do is find out, okay, we have 6 organizations during this year that are doing programs to increase fruit and vegetable intake, and they all 6 measure it in a different way. One uses a 24-hour recall of the participants where you sit them down and you say, tell me what you ate for the last 24 hours. And another uses something called a food frequency questionnaire, which is a survey type of tool that says, how often did you eat apples in the last week, in the last month, in the last year? How often did you eat carrots in the last week, in the last month? So food frequency questionnaires are often used because they're easy, but you can imagine they're not very accurate.
No.
Can you accurately tell me how frequently you ate something a month ago and 6 months ago?
No.
I mean, it's almost ridiculous. You don't have to be a nutrition scientist or an assessment specialist to know it's ridiculous to think that kind of tool is going to be very useful. So we've got this problem with shared measurement systems that oftentimes the work we're doing is hard to assess. And if we're using different tools, one group has people write down what they eat for 3 days, which is called a 3-day diet record. Another group does a 24-hour recall. Another group does a food frequency questionnaire. You cannot compare those to each other. So if you see a change in something, you can't really know, is it truly changing to which you can't say this group had a greater impact than this group. This program worked better than this program because you're comparing tools that aren't measuring the same thing. So, and then on top of that, for this work, it's in nutrition and physical activity work, it's really hard to accurately assess anyway if you're using self-report, which most community organizations do. And then most community organizations don't even use more standard tools from the research field. They just make up their own survey questions and ask people, and then they report on that. So the science of the assessment of the measurement is really poor typically in community settings. It's not a criticism of those community organizations. It's based on the resources and the knowledge and the skills. So going back to the Health Foundation, they have initiative areas in various different types of health. Like at that time, they were working in like smoking and tobacco and vaping, alcohol abuse, mental health. And then ever since they were first founded, they had something going on with regards to healthy eating and or nutrition and physical activity, active living. How they packaged that had varied over the years, but they decided to bring it together under one initiative that was administered, as one initiative called Healthy Eating, Active Living, or HEAL, HEAL. And so what they wanted to do was to apply collective impact to healthy eating, active living in the region with the goal of impacting obesity. So they had a little bit of a misperception there that we can talk about more with regards to obesity, and thinking that obesity is just about nutrition and physical activity. It absolutely is not. And I was able to start to work on their perceptions about that during the interview process, and listen to it and so forth. So I was able to bring that forward in our strategic planning when we started our research center. But so I was basically hired to start a center that would serve as the backbone organization for the HEAL initiative of the Paso del Norte Health Foundation. That's what brought me to El Paso. So I was the founding executive director of that center. It was a partnership. It was funded by the Health Foundation. The way the Health Foundation goes about getting things like this started is they will put out an announcement called a request for applications. And in that application, they said, we want someone to start a center. We'll do this. And whoever responds to that with a proposal that meets the expectations of the foundation, then they can get a grant to do it. And the response to that request for applications came from a partnership of universities, including UTEP, Texas Tech, and UT Health Science Center School of Public Health. And so you're at UTEP, you know what UTEP is. I'm guessing you know about Texas Tech here in El Paso. You know, it's medical school, nursing school, dental school, and so forth. Yeah. So Texas Tech Health Science Center. And then UT Health Science Center is UT Health Science Center at Houston is the official full name, because there's actually UT Health Science Center in San Antonio as well. And there might be one or two other ones, but UT Health at Houston is a large university based in Houston that has a medical school, a dental school, biomedical informatics school. I think there's one I'm forgetting, and a school of public health. And their school of public health is like the top ranking school of public health in Texas. And it's one of the top, I forget, handful in the whole country. Oh, wow. And so the UT Health School of Public Health has 6 campuses, because a long time there, the university itself is over 50 years old now, I believe. But several decades ago, the leadership started to recognize, if we're really going to do a good job with public health, we need faculty doing research in all parts of the state. So they started establishing campuses. And the campus in El Paso was established 30 years ago. That's how long we've been here now. So, so we're located in the Cardwell Collaborative, and we've been there for 3 years. That's the building where Medical Center of the Americas is located. I don't know if you're familiar with the building. No. It's right off of I-10. So if you drive along I-10, you've probably passed it, every single time you drive on I-10. It's a big-ish, it's not super huge building. It's only 3 stories, but it's got glass all along one side that faces the interstate. So when it first got built, maybe 10 years ago or so, it was kind of noticeable, because it's a really pretty building right along the interstate. And it's at the Reynolds exit. So kind of the same place you exit if you're going to Texas Tech or UMC. It's that same exit, but it's right on the interstate, so you can see it as well. So that's where we're located now. Previously, we were located in space owned by UT, because we're all part of the UT system, and the Board of Regents had said, hey, you guys should just share space. But now we're in a separate space. So I think that co-location with UTEP caused most people to be confused that UT Health was just part of UTEP. It's not, it's a separate university. But right. So this initial partnership to apply for the funds to get the center started was a 3-way partnership, UTEP, Texas Tech, and UT Health. But the Health Foundation said they wanted the administration of the grant to happen through UTEP. So when I was first hired, I was a UTEP employee, and we were administratively managed through UTEP, but we were physically located in Office Space, Texas, because that's where the foundation wanted us to be located. And then it's kind of a long, complex story, but over the course of about 5-6 years, I got the center built. We were doing really well. So I made a strategic decision to move the center from UTEP to UT Health. So now we're administered under the UT Health umbrella. So now my faculty appointment, which used to be at UTEP, is now at UT Health.
Okay.
So I've had a professor title at both of those schools, but I'm currently at UT Health. But the purpose of our center is still the same, to impact obesity throughout the region. A lot of that work focuses on healthy eating and active living. But what's important, and we still use the collective impact model. I'm just describing it briefly so you kind of understand that it's still my intent to address obesity regionally, and the collective impact model is an effective way to do that. It's a really tricky model to implement, though, if you don't have that core kind of funding, like the foundation provided to get us started. So using collective impact is different than what a lot of academic research centers do. Most academic research centers focus on research questions and research grants. So they'll just have these discrete projects that may be very powerful, very meaningful projects, but they may not plug into a larger coordinated effort, which is what collective impact model does. So what I'm trying to perpetuate here and continue to grow is an academic research center that uses collective impact model, but it is really challenging to do that. The way universities and funding mechanisms are set up makes it really difficult to do that. But that's kind of probably beyond the scope of your paper. I just wanted you to have sort of an understanding of what makes our center a little different than traditional research centers at universities. So I continue to work on this big picture goal of impacting obesity. We do have, the restructuring, moving from UTEP to UT Health meant that things were up in the air for a while. And a big part of my team was graduate students who have now finished their graduate work and moved on and so forth. So we've had, how we look today is a lot different than how we looked 3 years ago or 4 years ago. Plus we had the pandemic hit, of course, which makes everything different. But we've had our work continue that whole time. But our team looks different, the makeup of our team, and I'm in the process of rebuilding it. So by switching to UT Health, one of the biggest advantages is that I got commitment from the university to hire additional professors to be part of the research center, of hiring additional faculty to join our team. So more professors, which will help us, of course, expand our impact and the capacity of work that we can do. With that same focus of big picture, addressing obesity, but really focusing on what the community needs. So that's another thing that often happens with academic research is you've got researchers. To be successful in academia, you need to build your research profile. So you go from one project, you answer the questions of that project, but that typically creates like a dozen new questions that need to be answered. So you build your next research projects like that. Okay. Completely understandable because that's how you get grants. And grants are a big part of being successful if you're a scientist at a university. What I was able to do because we had this large grant from the Health Foundation, just to give you a sense, over the course of the first about 6 years of our existence, including about a year before I arrived, there was a planning grant in place. So if you count that planning period plus the first 6 years that I was running the center, we got probably in the neighborhood of $11 million from the Health Foundation.
That's amazing.
Which is a substantial amount of money. Because the money was there up front, promised and committed for those years, I didn't have to move to town and quickly submit 5-6 grant proposals to take my research from when I was at the USDA to the next step. I was able to pause on applying for grants, get to know the community, literally go around and meet with, dozens and dozens of leaders around the community and find out what are you doing to address obesity, to improve healthy eating and active lifestyles, and listen to what they're doing, evaluate what they're doing from a scientific perspective, like are they using evidence-based approaches or not, and then also understand what are the barriers for them being able to do this better. and then talk with them. Like, I would bring the science in, and I would respect that they're bringing in the experience, the boots on the ground, experience, knowing the community, knowing the culture, knowing, there's a big difference between what science tells us will work and actually getting that implemented in a community setting. So that's another thing that's somewhat unique about what we do, is that we start first at what the community tells us they need. Then we go out and find the science to support that, and either adapt existing work to meet the needs of our community, or if it's not out there, we build it with feedback and input from our community. Many times, as I said before, researchers have to start with what they're already doing, and then they go into the community. If they need a community setting to test a new approach, they go into the community to try and find partners who they can work with to test their idea. But we want to start with the community to figure out what the idea is even going to be in the first place. So that's a big difference in how we do things. Again, it's different because it's not easy. So we do it that way, but it's not typical, because that's not a very easy way to do it. But because we've had this investment from the foundation early on, I to at least get started this way. So if you hear reference to or see anything, like if you look on our website, there's going to be materials that refer to Paso del Norte Institute for Healthy Living, or we would just shorten it to Institute for Healthy Living, or IHL. That's the same. That's still us.
Oh, okay.
And now we're CCHI, Center for Community Health. Same focus, same people, same director, just different name. So, yeah.
Makes sense.
And so that kind of tells you how I got to where I am today. I know that was super long.
No, that was great.
You want to talk more specifically about obesity?
Well, since we went into like El Paso, what would you say, or what's your opinion on like what the community of El Paso needs?
Well, from the perspective nutrition, physical activity, and obesity, kind of focus on that.
Okay.
Of course, there's lots of needs that branch out from that.
Right.
And so it can be pretty tricky to try and boil it down and separate it, because, things like poverty play into things like healthy eating and
So actually,
physical activity and so forth.
that's actually part of my paper. And one of my questions was like how low income and poverty has a role on obesity.
Yeah. Yep. So one of the way I usually describe what we do as a center, I talk about the fact that we use the collective impact model, and that we focus big picture on addressing obesity regionally, including healthy eating and active living, but not exclusively focused on nutrition or physical activity. And then I describe our partnership areas. As I said, we're all about starting with community first. So we use community-driven solutions to impact obesity. And to do that, you have to have partnerships.
Right.
So just to give you a sense, we have 5 main partnership areas right now. So these are kind of the content areas. One of those is food systems, and that includes food insecurity and access to healthy and affordable food. And then the other partnership areas are primary care, or healthcare in general, because obesity is a complex disease and it has to be treated and managed clinically. It's not just about making sure people have healthy food and know how to prepare healthy food and will eat the healthy food. Obesity is caused by some dysregulation within the body that causes the body to store excess fat at a level that's unhealthy. So if you don't manage that cause, you can do, so much good work all over the community to address what I refer to as the contributors to obesity. But if you're not addressing the causes at the same time, then you're not going to be able to impact prevalence.
Right.
We do a lot of work with primary care providers who recognize, hey, our patients need help. We can't just keep telling them, you just got to eat healthier. That's going to fix it. If there's an internal driver, like if they have a hormonal dysregulation, one of the more common ones is something like thyroid, hypothyroidism.
Yes.
Well, if you have hypothyroidism, you can eat the healthiest food in the world. You can try your darndest to exercise every day, but your body is fighting against you. And it's going to be nearly impossible for you to achieve and maintain a healthy weight unless you treat the thyroid condition. There's at least 100, if not more, because the research world is still working on this, causes of obesity, internal, intrinsic causes. And then in addition to that, you've got all these contributors, like whether or not someone has a grocery store near their house and can buy healthy food, or if they have to buy it at a corner store or a fast food restaurant.
Right.
So, having only eating energy dense foods like junk foods or fast foods and so forth, that will contribute to obesity, but it doesn't cause obesity, because there's plenty of people who eat those kinds of foods and don't have any impact on their weight.
Right.
Having a neighborhood where you can't exercise contributes to obesity, but it doesn't cause obesity. So what we really have to do is work on ways to address both simultaneously at a population or community level if we want to impact performance.
Right.
And so one of our partnership areas is helping healthcare providers get the training they need so that they're helping identify and address the causes of obesity. But then it turns out the kind of training that's the best practice, I said we try and bring the best science and put it into practice in the community. That training takes a lot of time and a lot of knowledge.
Right.
Healthcare providers, especially in primary care settings, especially in those settings that deal with low-income patients, they don't have a lot of time. So we've invested a lot of grant money in our effort in the last few years to develop tools that help primary care providers better treat obesity with their patients in a cost-effective and time-efficient way.
Right.
And those two of those tools are software tools that we built in the last year.
Oh.
And so, the software makes it scalable and much quicker to use, which means we can reach more people at a lower cost. So that comes in on the cost front. On the food, just to briefly finish out the 5 partnership areas, we won't have time to talk about all of them. But I said we have food systems, we have healthcare, we have schools, and I don't know if we'll have time to talk about that today, but by targeting schools, you've got a really nicely captured audience, right? Because all kids have to go to school, kids have families that they are part of. So when you can deliver strategies through schools, you can reach large numbers and at an early age. So we have a lot of work that we've done in schools over the years. So school health is another partnership area. And similar to kind of in parallel to schools for kids, workplaces are a great way to target strategies for adults because you can help a lot of people in a system-wide kind of way. So we have some employee wellness partnership areas. That partnership area isn't as in-depth and broad yet, but that's an area that I'm looking forward to our center being able to expand when I get more faculty hired. And then the 5th partnership area, I broadly call it environmental health, because we've done some work looking at things like air quality and how that impacts obesity and metabolic health. We have a big study that we're wrapping up right now looking at public transportation and how that impacts obesity and access to things like healthy food and healthcare and so forth. So 5 partnership areas. When it comes to poverty, one of the biggest areas that comes into play, or 2 big areas, are those first 2 partnership areas I talked about. So access to healthcare to help treat the causes of the obesity becomes a problem.
Right.
Not only can people not find providers that know what they're doing, but then to pay for that treatment, if you don't have insurance, and even those who have insurance, we've got big policy problems with how most insurance is handled right now, where insurance companies are not covering treatment of obesity.
Wow.
They cover treatment of the diseases that come from obesity,
Right.
like diabetes and heart disease and cancer and liver disease. But you have to wait till you have those diseases sometimes to get the treatment.
Yeah.
So we're trying to do some work on the policy front to get those policies changed.
That's awesome.
So that people can get the treatment earlier in that chronic disease process, address the obesity up front, not wait until the subsequent diseases kick in. And then the other big area where poverty comes in is food access, of course. So we have a lot of work we're doing to improve the food environment. We've got amazing partners around this region, some that work more on the food production side. We don't do a whole lot with that directly, but we're trying to help integrate the work of those folks with work to ensure that more food that's grown locally. If you're trying to get people, one of the biggest categories of foods that can help improve the nutrition of a diet and decrease risk of diseases like diabetes and heart disease and cancer, but at the same time help with management of a healthy weight, are fruits and vegetables, because fruits and vegetables are nutrient dense but not calorie dense. So you can feel full with fewer calories, still get a lot of nutrients from those. So we want to encourage people to eat more fruits and vegetables. Right. Don't be mistaken into thinking that eating fruits and vegetables will cause weight loss.
Right.
But it is important that we have access to fruits and vegetables to address obesity. And so we're working on making sure food systems can include fruits and vegetables that taste good, and that, you know, if you're trying to encourage people to eat fresh fruit or vegetable and it's chucked for 3 days, it's not going to taste as good. It's going to perish in your kitchen much more quickly. Low income people, that's relevant. They don't want to waste money on food that's going to go bad before it gets eaten. And it makes your food system less resilient to food system challenges like a pandemic or a natural disaster if you rely on all your foods come from outside your reach. So there's a lot of reasons why a stronger, healthier, more resilient food system can lead to better health for the people in that food system. So we work with elected officials, nonprofit organizations, and for-profit entities like grocery stores.
Right.
And probably our biggest accomplishment in this area, like the most easily described tangible accomplishment, like I said, it's part of a bigger, more complex process, is that we helped establish Healthy Food Financing Initiative in El Paso County, and which is referred to as HFFI. And I can send you a report that we wrote a few years ago that came out of initially assessing the region through some GIS mapping, some interviews with stakeholders, and some surveys of residents. And then from that report, we had a food summit where we brought together community stakeholders, presented the data, and asked them what they thought would work best to address access to healthy and affordable food in our region. And one of the projects that came out of that was the Healthy Food Financing Initiative, which the county stepped up and took ownership of. So the county has now dedicated, we helped them get a policy in place that sets aside $1 million a year in funds that go to support projects. People can apply for these funds, in other words, with their own project ideas. But the criteria for the project is that it has to increase access to healthy and affordable food. So sometimes it's a food retail project, like establishing a new corner store that's going to sell healthy food. Or another project that got funded was a food hub, where they set up a warehouse in central El Paso so that they could aggregate locally grown food from farmers, get it washed and boxed up and stored in a cold room, and then shipped back out to people who are going to consume it, either end consumers or cafeterias or those kinds of things. So having that food infrastructure can also qualify for this funding. So we're the first county in the country to do a Healthy Food Financing Initiative. It's a model that had been tested in some cities and at the state level in some cases, but we're the first county to do it. So you can you can be proud of the fact that our county is leading the country in something so innovative.
That is so cool.
Um,
I wanted to ask you if you think that the El Paso obesity rate is higher or lower than the national average?
there's a website called healthypasodelnorte.org.
Okay.
It's all one word. That site is funded by the Paso del Norte Health Foundation. They pay a company to maintain that site. And the company collates data from different sources on that site. So it's kind of a data dashboard. That's the quickest, easiest way to find it because it'll compare for you El Paso County to state and national levels.
Okay.
And you can confirm that, but we're more or less about the same.
Okay.
It's not like drastically higher or lower. And then it always depends on how you break it down. You know, if you look at the population as a whole, or if you break it down by race and ethnicity, because what happens in most communities is that underrepresented minorities will have slightly higher rates than, say, Caucasians.
Right.
And so then just by the fact that we have a higher Hispanic, Latino representation, and so, you know, you would expect that we have slightly higher. It's not that necessarily the risks are higher. It has more to do with the population makeup in our region, like how you interpret differences can be important as well. But
Okay.
so the best way to do that is just to check what the latest data are there. I just keep it generally in my head that, you know, El Paso is comparable or slightly worse than state and national levels. And that's partly due to our demographics related to ethnicity and related to income. Lower income people tend to have higher rates of obesity as well.
Okay.
So, yeah. And nationally, we are now more or less at about 75% of our population has either excess weight, specified as overweight by, that's the medical term that gets used, at the BMI between 25 and 30, or has obesity. If you combine overweight and obesity and just say collectively all that excess weight, we're now at like 75%.
Oh, wow.
Nationally and regionally. So, yeah.
Okay. And then, do you think, like, in your opinion, do you think that access to healthy food is the biggest contributor for people in El Paso?
It's hard to say biggest contributor. We don't really way to, you know, I'm a scientist, so I like to not make statements like that based on instincts. I'd rather have data to show it.
Right.
And there's no real way to get data to say, you know, X% of obesity is caused by this and by this and by this, because it's more complicated than that. Like all these things interact. But we do, if you look at food insecurity, we do have high food insecurity rates. At one point, this was several years ago, I don't know what our current numbers are because the numbers got a little messed up with COVID. But at one point, 1 in 4 kids in El Paso lived in a food insecure home.
Wow.
And that's pretty high rates.
Yes.
So we do have a lot of food insecurity, and food insecurity in a complex way does increase risk for obesity. And it has to do with all these interacting effects of the stress that comes with food insecurity and the food choices that people make when they have food insecurity. And you overlay that with their propensity for obesity. Remember I talked earlier about having causes versus contributors?
Yeah.
So if someone does not have the internal makeup to cause obesity, food insecurity won't cause obesity in that person. Right. You have to have a physiological, biochemical, intrinsic something that predisposes you to obesity. But when you put a person with those kind of internal factors into a food insecure environment, then the food insecurity can really drive up the expression of the disease of obesity.
Okay, makes sense.
So, too often with obesity, people think of it as a lifestyle choice.
Right.
Like a person has obesity because they don't eat healthy food. If they just ate more fruits and vegetables and fewer cakes and sodas, then we wouldn't have obesity. And that's not true. Food does not cause obesity. I mean, if you think about that for just a moment, food does not cause obesity. Obesity is caused by some dysregulation within the body that causes the body to either consume more calories than it needs, to expend fewer calories than it should, or a combination of the two.
Right.
And so if a person has something within their body that is, let's say that there's a hormone missing that normally gets triggered when a person, we have hunger and satiety signaling going on in our body, right?
Right.
So when it's been many hours since we've eaten, there's hormones that start to get released that signal our brain that we should eat food. And then once we start eating that food, there's other hormones that signal our brain to stop eating food.
Right.
Now, in a healthy individual, those signals work really well, and they tightly control how much food we consume and how quickly we stop eating it, so that we're eating the amount of calories we need to maintain our weight in a healthy range. But if those hormones are dysregulated, and we know from a lot of basic science research that in many cases, we now know a lot about which hormones regulate this process, what kind of gene defects lead to non-optimal hormone signaling and non-optimal hormone reception. Like you have to be able to make a hormone, and then your cell receptors have to respond to that hormone. So it gets really complicated when you get into the biochemistry of it.
Right.
So we absolutely know there are complex systems within our bodies that regulate, and that's just eating the food. I'm not even talking about all the other aspects within our body that maybe influence how many calories we burn just by fidgeting during it. There's some fascinating research on that. And some people, they just fidget more during the day.
Right.
Like if they're sitting there on the couch, they're tapping pen on the table, or they're bouncing their leg up and down, or they're tapping their foot. Well, for a person who does that all the time, they're burning more calories, and those calories add up over time. So there's a case where something that they're not volitionally doing is driving more expenditure of energy. Other people will have just the opposite. They will move much less than the average person, burn fewer calories. And so, and then there's genetic control over how we distribute muscle and fat in our body, and that influences how many calories we need and how readily we burn calories and so forth. So there are at least 100 different pathways like this, probably more that we don't know about. And so if we're not addressing those causes, then we can't really hope to help people achieve and maintain a healthier weight. But too often, especially in more of a public health messaging context, we make it sound like it's really just about people being motivated to follow a healthy diet and exercise regularly.
Right.
And when we frame it that way, the problem is we're putting the blame on the individual when they're not able to successfully achieve and maintain a healthy weight. Mm-hmm. And when you blame the individual, then they are stigmatized for having obesity. And then we also know from a lot of research that stigma and bias around somebody's body size perpetuates further obesity.
Right.
because it not only messes with their mental health, because nobody feels good to be stigmatized, to be made fun of, to have derogatory comments made to them by strangers as they walk down the street. These are real things that happen to people with obesity.
Right.
We know that people with obesity are less likely to get hired for jobs, are less likely to get married. I mean, like, life sucks if you have obesity.
Right.
And it can start to accumulate, and you've got that mental health blow. But what that also does is it perpetuates physiological effects as well. And so if you compare two people where everything else is the same as far as their obesity level and their risk factors and so forth, and the only difference is that one of those people lives in a culture of stigma and bias and the other one doesn't, the person who's experiencing stigma and bias is not going to regulate their glucose levels as well. They're going to have all these other physiological problems as well that make their condition worse. So you've got physiological and psychological, emotional negative effects of bias and stigma, which is why it's so important that we help people understand that obesity is a disease that needs to be managed clinically. It's not the fault of the individual.
Right.
And we can't fix it with simple, it so often gets treated like, oh, it's easy. People just have to eat healthy and exercise more. And if they can't do it, it's their fault. They're just being lazy. Obesity is not laziness. It's not lack of willpower. It's not caused by food. It's not caused by not exercising. It's caused by something in the body that dysregulates how calories are stored, how many calories are consumed and burned, and how the remaining calories are stored. That's what obesity is.
Okay, it makes sense.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course, because I mean, you see people who eat the most unhealthy things and they're skinny mini and it's just different. So it totally makes sense.
And I know people who suffer from their whole life have struggled with their weight, and they eat very strict diets. They're very careful about the healthiness of the food they consume, lots of vegetables. I'm thinking of one person I know who's receiving treatment through one of our programs, and we did an interview with her recently. And she said, I mostly eat vegetables and fish with some like whole grains, and she exercises every day. She is so adamant and religious about her exercise that she keeps pushing herself to do more and more, and then injures herself from overuse exercise, overuse problems. So people who are unfortunate enough to have the genetic makeup that drives their bodies to store excess calories as fat, those people are across a whole spectrum of motivation and willpower and healthy eating and healthy exercise. Right. You've got some that don't do any of it. You've got some that put all of us to shame because they're so good about their diet and their exercise. So it is not about the responsibility of that individual. But if we can make available to them the kind of treatment of the treatments we have available, unfortunately, we haven't identified every cause and we haven't developed a treatment for the causes that we do know about. But we've made a lot of progress in the last 5 years. We've made a lot of progress, but a lot of progress, broadly speaking, in the last several decades. The problem is very few people have access to those treatments. Right. And the reason for that is that we don't have healthcare providers who are trained to manage obesity. So managing obesity and treatment of obesity are two overlapping things. The treatment is the actual helping people to lose weight. But if a person has obesity, you also have to manage all the coexisting and contributing factors that might be involved. So it's managing the health aspect. So when I talk about obesity management, that's a bigger umbrella, and weight loss and obesity treatment is within that.
Okay.
And you do see both of those terms get used. But we did not train healthcare providers in medical school and nursing school and so forth on obesity management or treatment. So there are treatment options available, but healthcare providers don't feel comfortable using them because they don't know how to use them, or they themselves have bias around obesity.
Right.
So there is really prevalent bias in healthcare providers with regards to thinking that obesity is the fault of the patient, and it's really up to the patient to, have the willpower to lose weight. It's not the role of the healthcare provider to help in that. So if we don't have healthcare providers who understand this, then the patient can't get the help they need, and they face more stigma and bias if they try and get the help, which just makes the problem worse.
Yes.
One reason we don't do a good job of treating it is that our providers aren't trained and they aren't aware. Another reason is that the treatment strategies, like anti-obesity medications, even if a provider is aware, has the training, and feels comfortable prescribing it, the anti-obesity medications are often not covered by health insurance and so forth, and they can be quite expensive. So we have some really good drugs now, pharmacotherapy, that can help address some of those internal causes of obesity that I mentioned. Right. But if they're not covered by insurance, many people aren't going to be able to use them. And then another problem we have is we don't have treatments for all of this, so we need more research for that to happen. So these are all problems that are at the root of them is addressing the causes of obesity. Right. And our center is where, that's why we have healthcare as one of our big partnership areas, because we're working on how do we make training for providers and support to take that training into the clinic. How do we do that in a scalable way that we can get a whole community, like make it scalable at a community level? And so that's one of the big things we're working on now, is seeing how well can we make, for example, affordable and science evidence-based treatment of obesity available to patients.
That's awesome. Well, that is a lot of information, but it was super great talking with you. I think you covered almost everything I've written down to ask you. So it's been super informative. Thank you so much.
You are welcome. How did you get interested in this topic? Why did you pick it?
I have always been interested in just health and wellness, and I'm always just looking up just for fun, like ways to be healthy and lifestyle and all that. And you're supposed to just pick a topic. It could be any topic you wanted. And my family also struggles with weight loss and stuff, and I don't, but my family does. And I've always been it's always been there. It's so super interesting to me.
Is your family from El Paso?
No, we're from Huntsville, which is like north of Houston.
Okay. You're a student at UTEP?
Yes, ma'am. We live here now.
Oh.
Yeah.
What's your major?
Nursing.
Nursing. Well, there you go. You've got a career path that could really open up opportunities for you to be part of the solution if you want to.
Yes, that would be amazing.
Well, we will be doing additional training. If you're interested in pursuing more in this area, just shoot me an email and I can keep you on our contact list and so forth if you'd like to learn more or participate in any of our training programs or anything like that. You'd be welcome to.
Okay, awesome. That would be
the more
great.
partners we have who are passionate about this in the region, the better.
Awesome. Thank you. And I saw that the NASEM has like workshops.
Yeah,
Do you know when the next workshop is?
yeah. One clean up, and if you can't attend, it's going to be virtual again. And there's National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. I assume that's what you're talking about.
Yes.
They have a lot of content area, but they have a specific roundtable on obesity solutions. And so those are the workshops that are specific to obesity. I helped to organize the one that happened in July, but it's a little hit or miss. Some of the people involved in those workshops are still not quite understanding the bigger picture of obesity and how to streamline and focus efforts in that area. There's some great people involved, and there's some other people that are kind of, pulling the focus away from the actual causes of obesity and, using it as more of a platform for some other things that are important areas to consider, but they aren't areas that by focusing on, we're going to be able to put a dent in obesity, for example. So it's something, you can certainly join that and listen. But there may be some communication, like I'll give you one example. There was a speaker we had at the July workshop, and the whole focus of the workshop was community level strategies and what do we do to address obesity at a community level. And so one of the speakers was a guy who worked for a foundation, I want to say in New York, somewhere on the East Coast. And he talked about a really interesting effort of community members who sort of got in board to advocate for better parks. And I don't remember the details now, if it was improving park quality or improving the number of parks. But it was a neat story of community advocacy, because members in the community kind of came together and advocated to elected officials to improve this about their community. And from a community change perspective, what he was talking about was impressive. But he was just talking about parks, no mention of obesity. So when we got to the end of it, during the Q&A, the moderator said, so what does this have to do with obesity? And his response was, well, everybody knows that more parks means less obesity.
Oh,
man. And I was like, I had made such efforts to line up the series of speakers so that everyone would frame all their talks and the whole conversation in this context of addressing both causes and contributors of obesity. So parks is an example. Having safe parks that are readily accessible, like in people's neighborhoods, is important, because people who can have access to parks could use those parks for physical activity. There's a lot of research around parks and being outside and being outdoors in nature and the mental health benefits. And, because things like stress and increasing cortisol in the body can drive food-seeking behaviors that are higher in caloric content and fat content and so forth, mitigating stress can be a good thing too. But any research studies looking at interventions around have shown they don't impact obesity.
right.
So they might be important, because if a person is seeking treatment, let's say from a physician, let's say now their neighborhood actually has a clinic where there's a healthcare provider who understands obesity, can help them identify what's causing the obesity, maybe prescribe medication that will help them lose weight and help them get a diet plan where they won't feel hungry all the time while maintaining a negative energy balance so that they can lose weight. Only then should they even start an exercise protocol. That's another big mistake people make, is that they try and promote exercise as a solution for weight loss, whereas really it's something that should come in after weight loss has started, especially in people with more severe obesity, because you can damage the body a lot if you get someone thinking they need to exercise really hard and they're carrying a lot of excess weight. It can damage their joints and musculoskeletal system and so forth. So, parks are so far down the list, but they fall into that category of contributors.
Right.
Once that person has treatment, has the support to start to lose the weight, they do need to be able to exercise more regular. So having access to a park can be important. But if all we do is focus on the parks and we don't make sure everyone in the community has access to treatment, that's going to be problematic.
Right.
And then the other thing to keep in mind is just having a park there doesn't mean someone's going to use it.
Exactly.
So, the Paso del Norte Health Foundation has put a lot of funding into trail development in our community. And they started doing it in that context of their Healthy Eating, Active Living initiative that we were the backbone organization for. And I had multiple conversations with their leadership. And one of their leadership people really gets this. Mm-hmm. I just don't know how well he's able to keep it forefront in the minds of board members and the president and others who make decisions about funding. But you can't just build a trail and think having a trail there is going to lead to better health in the community. Right. You need to pair it with other efforts that make people aware of the trail, that change attitudes and beliefs about exercise, that maybe offer programming. You have to kind of identify what's going to help people use that trail and then drive programming and support around that. So it gets pretty complicated when you think at these community levels.
Right.
So you may run into that if you attend the workshop. I can't promise that the whole workshop is going to be framed with a full understanding of this complex perspective that we need to take when it comes to obesity, even though it is the National Academy of Sciences.
Well, hopefully,
I just out here and so don't.
Sure. Hopefully in the future that can change.
Yeah, if you want to do resources, mention the Obesity Society. If you just Google the Obesity Society, I think the website is like obesitysociety.org or something like that.
Yes.
They have some resources, and that's a society that I'm a member and a fellow of, and they do a really good job of sticking to what the science tells us about obesity.
Okay.
Then there's another organization called Obesity Action Coalition. And again, if you just Google that name, you'll come to their website. And they are kind of a patient advocacy group. And we work, I say we, because I have a leadership position with the Obesity Society. I serve right now as their secretary treasurer, which is just a voluntary role. I'm not telling you anything because of any associations where I make money for doing it. So to be clear.
Right. Okay.
It's just part of my professional activities. So Obesity Society works closely with Obesity Action Coalition. Obesity Action Coalition really works on the advocacy side, which means supporting patients. So helping patients better understand obesity, how to talk to their healthcare provider about it. They have information pages on different things like causes of obesity and medications for obesity, surgical treatment of obesity. So helping patients be more informed. And then they also do a lot of work trying to advocate to change policies to better support obesity treatment and care. And so I've worked with them in that capacity. And they do work to kind of raise awareness of all the things we've been talking about, that obesity is a disease and we need to do more to decrease stigma and bias around this, stop blaming the individual so that we can make progress towards meaningful solutions.
Right.
So those are two organizations. Subtle thing you can do to be part of the solution is to do what we call using people first language. Okay. And you may have heard of that if you're in nursing school. This language is when we talk about the person with the disease, instead of using the disease, as an adjective to describe the person. For example, we talk about a person having cancer. We don't talk about a cancerous person.
Okay.
But with obesity, for some reason, we're really used to just saying that obese person or that person is obese.
Right.
Instead of saying that person has obesity.
Okay.
So it's considered to be helpful in reframing, when you say an obese person versus a person with obesity, it sounds less blaming and less stigmatizing to say for people first language.
Right.
And it's obesity is not the only field where this gets advocated for. You see it in mental health. You see it in like a friend of mine is a school teacher, and she says, "Oh yeah, we do that same thing when we're talking about kids with special needs. It's the child with the disorder, not the disordered child.
Right. Which
the
makes
child
sense.
with autism, not the autistic.
Right.
And you can do the same with diabetes. The person has diabetes rather than the diabetic person. So the best way to kind of check yourself, because if you're not used to doing that, it's easy to slip. I had to put some effort into working on this, and it's considered like I'd say in the past 10 years, the field has really pushed to encourage people to use people first language more. So if you go into older literature and even some current literature, you'll still see the word obese used a lot.
Okay. Well, that's super helpful. I wouldn't have thought of that. So thank you.
Yeah. And then if you ever use images, that's another way that bias and stigma gets perpetuated. If you look at media, websites, and so forth, when they talk about obesity, even just healthy eating and weight loss, the images of people with obesity tend to have like the head kind of they're cropped so that the face doesn't show, which kind of dehumanizes them.
Right.
Or they'll show people with obesity doing unhealthy behaviors.
Right.
Or socially undesirable circumstances. Like it's really common to see an image of a person with obesity. It's cropped so you can't see their face. They're wearing ill-fitting clothes, like a t-shirt that's too tight so their belly hangs out. And they're holding, like a big cheeseburger.
Right.
And so it's like tying these behaviors of eating unhealthy. It kind of implies, oh, this person eats cheeseburgers. That's why they have obesity. And look at them, those fools. They can't even find clothes that fit.
Right.
So it's much more dignified. You wouldn't do that with a person who has hypertension, right?
Right.
Hypertension is a disease. Hypertension can be addressed by eating healthier and exercising more. But we don't stigmatize people with hypertension the way we do people with obesity. So there are some data banks and image galleries where you can find photos, like the Obesity Action Coalition has one. If you just Google Obesity Action Coalition photo gallery, you can get free access to photos, professional photos taken with models who have posed. And the models have obesity, but they're wearing, professional looking clothes. They're engaging in healthy activities like exercise, preparing healthy meals, having a professional looking job, playing sports, those kinds of things. And so they're just much more positive images. So if you need an image for anything you're ever writing, I would encourage you to use one of those galleries and give some thought to that.
Right. Okay. Awesome.
Righty. And I teach a class on obesity. So if you're ever looking for an extra class to take, it's through UT Health, but you're welcome to join the class. You are welcome. Thanks for your interest in the topic.
Yes, ma'am. It's been so great talking to you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to my interview with Dr. Whigham. As you can see, she's a wealth of knowledge in the field of obesity, and she's a part of our local community. I hope you all enjoyed our time with Dr. Whigham and what makes her special in the field of nutritional science, her local initiatives, and efforts to reduce obesity in the El Paso region, and the topic of obesity itself on a macro level.